Well, just as a quick introduction, when Chip Ray set up this series of lectures, he was interested in having topics that were of local interest. So as you can imagine, it was real estate, gardens, water, food, and wine. And we have come to a highlight of the season, our Winemakers panel. We have three of the leading winemakers, if not the leading winemakers of the East End here. And let me just introduce them. Kareem Massoud, he's a partner and winemaker at Pontomac on the North Fork. Kelly Urbanik Koch, who is the winemaker at Macari on the North Fork, and our representative from the South Fork, Roman Roth, from partner and winemaker at Wolfer. And so our moderator tonight, we were very lucky to get Amy Zavatto. Amy is a published author of a number of articles and an expert on food and wine. And she's also, happens to be the executive director of the Long Island Merlot Alliance. So I want her to have as much time as possible. I'm going to hand the microphone, hopefully working, to Amy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, super. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, and I know it's an nth of the passion that each of these amazing people to my left have. Each of these winemakers, they are really, truly tastemakers for our region. And in the United States, we call the places we grow grapes and the places we make wine AVAs, or American Viticultural Areas. And although it wasn't the first, California certainly established itself as a very famous one. And I think, believe it or not, at this point, every state in the union makes some form of a table wine. But after about 50 years of, I think 50 years we're in now, of more?
40 something, like some 74.
We're gonna 47. We're gonna even it out a bit. And a lot of hard work and a lot of passion, a lot of learning, a lot of really incredible risk taking. Long Island, I think, has unequivocally established itself as one of the top winemaking regions in our country, and we should all be very, very excited and proud of that. And the people who sit to my left are certainly the forerunners in this. And each of them brings a unique perspective, and I think also I can say a common goal to our region. Part of becoming a world-class wine region is about establishing who we are as a wine region and what our wines are like. And I'd like to kick this off by asking each of you that question. If each of these people in the audience had a dinner party tomorrow night, and they were serving Long Island wine to guests who'd never had it before, how should they describe it? What are our wines like? Kareem, you're right to my left. Do you want to start?
Sure. So I think the quick answer to that is that they're moderate, well-balanced wines, and they're delicious. And then in terms of what we do at Pontomac, and I think it's true for a lot of the leading producers on the east end of Long Island, the overarching goals are deliciousness and balance. But in a nutshell, our wines, since we're a cool climate and a maritime climate, the wines that grow in that kind of climate are going to be a result of that terroir, which means they're going to be more moderate in alcohol.
Kelly, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I could echo everything he said. I mean, well-balanced, refreshing, great acidity, pairs well with all our local seafood and foods that we grow out here. And of course, the moderate alcohol is a big thing. People are really looking for something they can have more than one glass of without falling asleep. So, when we're out, like especially during the summer and enjoying this beautiful weather and having a few glasses of rosé with dinner or whatever, and that's kind of what we're able to provide. So.
Yeah, I think there's two ways. One is that this elegant, this moderation with the alcohol, that we have an intensity. And that to me is one of the greatest wines in the world, when you have elegance and balance and intensity. That's what makes it interesting. That's what keeps you alive, cleanses your palate when you have a big seafood dish, whatever, like a salmon steak or a lamb or anything. And that nobody can make that better, I think, in America than Long Island, to make these food-friendly wines. And that, again, people grew up California, California, California. So when we make these statements, it sounds a little bit funny in some ways, but this is where it's going. This is what's coming through now, that less is more, actually. It doesn't have to be always the big gun that hits you like cough syrup or with a 4x4 over the head. And that's the strength of this climate.
You each mentioned either the words well-balanced or hinted at that concept. What does that mean for these people? What is well-balanced? Is it objective? Is it subjective? How do you define it as winemakers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, when I talk about balance, I like to use the analogy of walking on a tightrope, or at least with regard to alcohol. Mm-hmm. And when a wine becomes out of balance with regard to alcohol, where it's we'll use the expression that the wine's getting too hot or too alcoholic. I like to make the analogy of walking on a tightrope. The further out you walk on that rope, becomes more and more dangerous. But if you can keep the wine in balance, the wine can be a spectacular wine. But it's easier for the wine to become out of balance, more awkward, more clumsy, more out of balance, the higher you go in alcohol. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's really answering the question, but the balance is having not one. It's having fluidity and harmony in the wine, and not have one component of the wine stand out more than the other. They're all, the sum of the parts make the whole so much stronger in terms of the acid, the tannin in a red wine, the alcohol, the aroma, everything about the wine, the color, the visual sort of suggestion of the wine before you even taste it. All should be this start to finish togetherness, this focus that gives the wine balance overall.
Would either of you like to add anything to that, or you think that was pretty beautiful?
If we only could always find it in life.
Digging a little deeper into this idea of terroir, both Kareem and Kelly, you are on the North Fork. Roman, of course, you're on the South Fork, but you also work with some North Fork grapes. What differences do you see? And one more point, you're further to the west than Kelly, so then it gets a little warmer, I think we could say. What differences do you see among those small kind of microclimate issues from Long Island, from the north to the south, from the west to the east? How does that affect the wines? And
well, I always like to say, if it would have been up to me, it would all be called East End of Long Island.
yes.
There would be one region. To divide this tiny wine region into 2 or 3 wine appellations is a little bit of a marketing blunder, but that ship has sailed many years ago. Mm-hmm. So there are slight differences, for sure. The further east you go on the North Fork, the more similar I would say comes to the South Fork, the climate, the ocean influence, the sea breeze. The further you go to Jamesport and where Pomanock is, basically, and Riverhead, the warmer it gets. So there's certainly sort of an advantage for reds there in some years, but I would have kept it East End of Long Island.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kelly, what do you notice?
I mean, we're also
Further
compared to a lot of the wineries, we're also a little further west,
Mm-hmm.
Similar to Pomanock. So the big differences we'll see in bud break timing or flowering. Sometimes, if we have a weather event, like a lot of rain during flowering, we might get either a better or a worse fruit set than other spots on the North Fork. But these are all the small differences. I kind of agree with Roman that in the end, those things kind of balance out because we're all surrounded by the water. We're all having the moderation of the water on our climate. So it's pretty similar overall.
Yeah, I mean, the macro climate, we certainly share the cool climate, the maritime climate. But then we have what are called the mesoclimates, which are kind of like these climates that are specific to that locale. And like Roman said, we like to, over in Riverhead, we like to say we're in the banana belt of the East End, because it's
Which is a real term. It's a real wine term.
it is statistically, it is warmer in terms of the average heat summation, and that does give us, let's put it this way, an easier time of fully ripening, especially the late ripening red varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon and Petit Verdot that we grow. But the other point I would make is the soils. On the North Fork, we have a sandy loam with sandy, gravelly subsoils, and in wine, site is incredibly important, the specific site. And but that said, there is a relatively high degree of homogeneity in our soils vis-a-vis other regions around the world, where you might, in some parts of the world, there's one hillside that will vary drastically from another, and we have more uniformity in our soils, at least on the North Fork. I think one big difference you have in the South Fork is the Bridgehampton loam, which we don't have on the North Fork. But what we all share is these sandy, gravelly subsoils, which are absolutely essential. I mean, it's an existential characteristic of our region. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have the incredibly well-draining soils that we do. And that goes hand in hand with the fact that our topography is basically flat. And if you're wine lovers, you know that most of the best sites in the world, or many of the best sites, are on hillsides. Mm-hmm. But the reason we sort of get away with being on flat land is the same exact reason that they do so in some of the most prestigious appellations in Bordeaux, which is also primarily flat. In both cases, the soils drain extremely well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kelly, now you came from Napa. You originate from Napa Valley, correct?
Yep.
Right? And you began your career in Long Island at Quarry Creek and Bedell, who I would venture to say had a pretty modern style of winemaking when you were there, and still today. Now you're at Macari, and this lovely family-run operation. You and Joe Macari seem to really be pretty symbiotic in how you think about the expression of the grapes. I know that he is pretty fond of non-interventionist methods when he can. I know you've experimented with some really interesting types of winemaking, and just showing that purity of fruit. Tell us why you came here, why you stayed, and what it's like working where you are now.
All right. So
it's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'll keep it short because I'm not a big talker. But so I came to Long Island originally just looking for experience in a different region. And I had grown up, I actually grew up in St. Helena, which is about half an hour north of Napa, and it's a very small town. And I had lived there my whole life. And I went to school about an hour away in Davis. And after working in Napa a couple of years, I was kind of looking to see what the rest of the world was like, and so I chose the furthest place away. That was still in the U.S. And I came to Long Island kind of looking to stay for a couple of years and see what it was like, and eventually go back. But I never went back, and there's a lot of reasons why I'm still here. I love Long Island. I feel really proud of the region. I stand behind the wines here, and I think that we're doing really exciting things, and it's fun to be a part of something that's different, and that we're kind of still defining, or we're creating the history of a new region, and that's pretty cool. Yeah. So we're still writing that story. So that's why I'm still here, and I feel really proud of Long Island. And a lot of people think I'm crazy for coming here, and I don't think I'm crazy at all. So I have actually a lot of people from California who are always asking me, like, oh, are there any opportunities out on Long Island? What's going on? And there's not always a lot of opportunities. We're a small region, and a lot of the winemakers have been around for a long time. So that's kind of that part of the story. As far as being with the Macaris, I've been at Macari now for 7 years, and when I started working there, I immediately felt like I was right at home. Just I knew their daughter. She was one of my first friends when I moved out here, and working with Joe, exactly what you were saying. Joe is very passionate about the vineyard, and he's very passionate about the expression of his vineyard. And so when I'm making the wine, it's basically trying to give a direct interpretation of what we're doing out in the vineyard. Not too much new oak, not too much winemaking tricks, which, you know, the fruit's really awesome fruit. It's some of the best fruit I've seen in my whole career. So it's kind of fun to work with that. And Joe's very, if you've ever met him, he's very open to experimentation, and he's kind of expects that. Mm-hmm. So when we're bringing fruit in, we'll always kind of have some experimental things going on and kind of seeing what we can do that's different from the vineyard, and kind of trying different fermentation styles, because we're still figuring out what works best. So, yeah, so.
I don't think you're crazy, and I think we're lucky to have you. Roman, now your family, I do believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, had some winemaking background and some spirits making background as well. So, you know, you could have stayed in Germany and not come to the United States. I'm sure you could have gone many, many places.
Could have been huge.
Could have been, you chose Long Island, and maybe at the time that you chose it, like now, as you were saying, Kelly, lots of people, oh, how do I get a job there? How do I get a job there? You chose it at a time when maybe it was a little more tenuous and a little more risky. But I will say that you took a chance, and both you've become such a great advocate and an important advocate for our region in both your incredible winemaking and in your outreach and your passion for the region. Roman is also the president of the Long Island Wine Council. If you did not know, he's a very busy man. And I certainly think of you as somebody who has been a really positive, very strong influence. What made you come here, and what drives this passion of yours for this region? And thank you.
Well, I started with 16 to my winemaking apprenticeship in Germany, and my father was a cooper, a barrel maker and a winemaker, and had a wine merchant business. And well, I was 10 years younger than my two older brothers, 11 and 10 years younger, so one took the business, and I certainly went out in the world to look for my fortune. Followed Christian Wolfer's invitation that Manhattan is half an hour away from the Hamptons. The New York stretch of the truth, but it did work. In 1992, my wife and I came out here in East Hampton on Lily Pond Lane the first 6 months. We should have never moved, I guess. Went back to Sagaponack from there. Anyway, well, I don't know, wine is my passion in Germany. Of course, you choose a career very early on, and with 16 I started, and you don't really waver from there. You know, that's one of the things how I grew up. And coming to Long Island, well, with Christian Wolfer was a great start. There was an owner who wanted to make something special, spent money to make something special. And most important over the years, and I think what's nice here is we are all working for family. We are all, I'm a partner at Wolfer, but we are all family estate owned, family estates, not owned by an insurance company or something where the profit margin counts. It's the passion of the winemaking. When the vineyard tells you something, you really can follow that lead and make that wine, while in the corporate world you cannot. By the time you're done with that, those grapes have rotted away by the time you get the yes. It's how the great dessert wine, the late harvest, was invented in Germany, because the bishop gave too late his blessing, and by the time they picked the grapes, it was a botrytis dessert wine. So it can work, I guess, in your favor, but usually it does not work very well. And we have these families behind this. And at Wolfer Estate, I mean, location, of course, is a key. That we are in the middle of the Hamptons has been a big blessing. But we've always had a great team. But I think that was the Christian understood. You can't be good at everything. I can only be here now because my assistant was bottling till 5:30 today. Richie, our vineyard manager, is out there in the vineyard at 88 degrees heat today. The whole crew, actually. The detail that of the money that we spend in our vineyard is tremendous, and I've been to almost every wine region, a lot of wine regions out there. You have to fly far to see a vineyard that is that manicured, where every shoot and every cluster counts. And every winery tries, and sometimes it's a struggle, and you can get behind. And I'm not saying that we always do everything right, but the effort that goes there's almost as a machine, as a team, a will behind it, as a plan, and that helps you to. In the good years, you get away with murder. You can make anybody can make good wines, but in these tricky years, it's that extra step, that extra precautious taking care of it pays off. And I think with that, and then you have to like people. If you don't like people, don't go in the wine business. So it is. I mean, Mondavi, I think, was 240 nights a year on the road promoting Mondavi, and I'm certainly a fair share of my days on the road. This week, every night of the week, actually. But I love it. It's not work. It's your passion. So.
Kareem, you're the person on our panel who is a second-generation winemaker, and you have both two very rich winemaking histories to sort of draw from, Germany and Lebanon. And you've been very innovative with grapes like Chenin Blanc. I'm a big fan of your new natural wine series. You're sort of pulling back and letting the beautiful grapes express themselves. I've been drinking that Chenin Blanc, like hoarding it. You really seem to carry on that entrepreneurial, risk-taking ideal of your father and your mother. How has that influenced your winemaking, your business, where you plan to go in the future?
Well, I think, you already kind of touched on it a bit. By the way, we call them minimalist wines.
Thank you. I can't believe I did that.
Yeah. No, it's good. It gives me a good opportunity to talk about it. So just briefly, we prefer the word minimalist because we don't think natural is the right word. Natural is really a misnomer. Some of you, or maybe all of you, are familiar with the so-called natural wines. And anyway, just a 30-second speech on my soapbox. Natural really isn't the right word, or at least for the wines we make. Minimalist much more accurately describes these wines. They're made in a very minimalist way. And natural just implies it's made whatever.
It can mean anything, really.
It's a whole can of worms that's being opened up. But they are made in a very minimalist way. Some people would call them in a natural way. And I can talk about that more. But if you're saying the risk-taking approach, is that or how we see ourselves?
Your parents took a chance. You took a chance
yeah.
in coming back to the family business, which you weren't going to, I believe. So.
Right, absolutely. So exactly, my parents took the biggest gamble of all, which was buying a potato farm on the east end of Long Island and planting grapes.
Yeah.
Now, they weren't the first to do that, but they were the 12th or
what
the 13th.
Year did your parents?
1983. And so today, in 2017, my family, my parents are one of a handful of the first estate wineries that's still owned and operated by the founders. Mm-hmm. And so they definitely, made quite a large gamble. And but I definitely have a healthy appetite for risk when it comes to how we do what we do. I think it was already said how we like to experiment, and I think that a lot of us on Long Island continue to experiment. But it's a common concept in life and in business, and you're not going to succeed if you don't take risks. And it's extremely exciting, fulfilling, and rewarding to be able to do what we do, where we have the freedom and the liberty to do what we do in the new world, in the world of wine. We talk about the old world and the new world. And for example, in Europe, you're constrained. You can't do certain things, or at least if you want to get the correct appellation on the bottle, you're limited in what you can do. And so, I'm very excited to have the opportunity to sort of follow in my father's footsteps, and the third generation is on the way too. I've got 2 kids of my own. My 2 brothers, who are also involved full-time, also have kids of their own, so the third generation is already growing at Pamanag.
I'd like to talk a minute about fashion. We have trends in clothing, we have trends in music, wine also has trends in fashion. It seems like the world's kind of caught up to Long Island now. It used to be so much more like go big or go home, big blousy wines that were, big Cabernets and whatever. But people are really seeming to come around to wines with more elegance, more beauty in that way, more balance. Do you think that how does Long Island fit into this sort of part of where the world is going in wine, and what happens when it changes or doesn't? How does
I
fashion
think
fit
Long
into it?
Island had its fair share to help make this trend. It's not just that it happened by itself. There's this kind of small wine regions, cooler climate that finally have made enough noise, and where people slowly, you could call it graduate. You start off with some simple bulk wine, Lieb Fraumilch, Mateus, whatever people started off. Finally, it went all the way to the big guns of California, the big, heavy, rich, or Australia or Argentina. And then finally now is this curve, a balancing move where people find that you can't always go, more is not always better, because it becomes top heavy, the wine, it loses its finesse and its elegance and what it was supposed to be. I mean, in the olden days, people added water. When you see old stories of soldiers, whatever, the Romans got 6 or 8 liters a day of wine as a ration. So obviously it must have been watered down, or it wasn't there to the same level, and now you see 16, 17 volume% wine, and it's just, it loses, it's too much. And this is where Long Island really shines. And
You mentioned a word just now, top heavy. I think, 80% of the wines that are purchased are consumed immediately. And then there's this other 20% that's cellared. I have a much larger collection of Long Island wine than my husband probably would like, just because he would like to see, maybe more beer. But I love opening these wines 10, 20, 30 years. But I don't know that, I think people forget to cellar their Long Island wines. How do we fit into that? Where are we in putting down wines? Why should people put down Long Island wines?
Well, they should put them down because they're amazing after 10 or 15 years in the bottle. And I think a lot of wineries now, I'm sure you guys do this too, is create wine libraries, and that's what we're doing at McCary, is each vintage holding some of the wine back and actually cellaring it for the customer basically, and releasing library wines down the road, so that people who, it's hard to have a nice wine cellar and keep it temperature controlled, and it's hard to not open that bottle over the course of 15 years. So that's what we're trying to do, is hold back a few cases of our reds and re-releasing them, or having events so people can taste them. And it's really worth the wait, to be honest. With the acidity and the right tannin balance in our wines, they age incredibly well and get a lot more complexity over time. And we've been opening bottles. I think you were there for one of the tastings. We opened the 97 Cab Franc, the first Cab Franc Joe ever made, which is showing beautifully. It's very green, which our wines have gotten a different style since then. But actually, I think that's what helped it age, that acid, and it really started getting these tertiary aromas and just really beautiful. So,
I think the biggest change is on this is when people age wine, it's this bragging right. Oh, I have a case of Krug champagne and I haven't even touched the bottle. It's like this show of I can age my cases of $400 wines and whatever. And Long Island didn't fit into this theory. That's why people wear an Hermes belt and drive a Range Rover, because it shows you have style and you have money. And serving a Long Island wine didn't show that you had money or style. And finally, I think we've broken that barrier with some of the wines from Long Island, our rosé, the summer in a bottle, for example. So some of the high-end wines that all of these wineries here that we all make, or every winery has a high-end wine. And that's slowly now coming. And finally, that will be the next wave. It's this still an unknown. A lot of people don't know that Long Island whites can age 30, 40 years. So it will take time.
I mean, I think what I would add to that is, like Kelly was saying, and I think the same is true of Wolfers, that we do definitely keep a library of our wines. And but the larger question of why you should age wine is all about taste. I mean, if you ask me. And it's an interesting question because I don't think the number is 80-20 in terms of people who buy wine and drink it and those who sell it.
It was
I
just
think,
a beverage media.
I'm not sure we know what the number is, but I talk about it often, and I think it's more like 95-5. Or I mean, the point is, most people. The fact is, most statistics show that people buy wine and they drink it. It's the exception, not the rule, that people actually sell their wine, that they'll age the wine. But anyway, be that as it may, we all produce what the French call vin de garde, wines for keeping, wines for cellaring. And one of the fascinating things about wine is that you've captured this snapshot of a growing season, and that's why it's fun whenever we talk with other farmers. They're like, how did you remember that? I'm like, well, we remember the vintage, because you've captured the growing season in the bottle. And that's one of the fascinating things about drinking a developed or an aged wine, is you have, it was Galileo, I believe, who said wine is sunshine held together by water. And it's sunshine from that year, from that vintage. And but to the point of taste, I mean, it is it may or may not be an acquired taste, but it's a taste, and it's interesting because most people don't do that. Most people buy wine and they drink it, but wines that are built or made to age, there's a saying that a fellow winemaker has used, which is a great wine should be enjoyable at any stage of its development. And so I'll leave it at that.
One thing that's coming now, as we're slowly getting grayer and blonder, is, we finally come to the point where we're opening soon. In another 2-3 years, we have sommeliers come to visit the winery, and I can open their birth year, and that goes a long way. If you ever had that experience,
I've started to do that. Yeah.
Just lately, the other day, I did this to somebody, and actually a kid of a very wealthy parents, some super tour we gave, and he had never had his own birth year drank. He even had everything else you could wish for in your life, but he'd never had it. So it was a unique experience that he'll never forget. So, and the wine was good.
Something I'm sure you each have heard, I've certainly heard. We are sitting in East Hampton right now. The land is not cheap. The land is not cheap on the North Fork. So I hear people talk, or occasionally grumble about our wines. Long Island wines are expensive. They're so expensive. But they don't complain about that with California wines, per se. I'd like to talk a little bit about what goes into the making of a wine that makes the price what it is. I'd like to talk about the diversity of price point with Long Island wine, if you will talk about that as well. And just give people an idea of why a wine costs what it does, what goes into it.
Well, I think there's two parts there. One is there's a floor by which we can't go below, or at least most of us can't go below in terms of price, because our cost structure is just simply so high. The other part of that point that you brought up, which is a great discussion, is the value or the perceived value of the wines that we produce. But the cost is easy. If you look on the globe, if you look at a globe, what is Long Island near as far as what I like to call the epicenters of? We're not near an epicenter of wine, like Northern California, like the whole continent of Europe. like Chile and Argentina are kind of a nexus. Australia, South Africa, these are all massive wine industries from which we are geographically removed. And the point is, every piece of specialized equipment we use in the vineyard and in the cellar, we pay a premium for because it had to be shipped from somewhere. And that's just one part of our cost structure. Then, as you know, if you're Long Islanders, if you're East Enders, the cost of real estate, the cost of property taxes, the cost of electricity, the cost of labor. I mean, it's about as high as almost anywhere in the world.
The sandwich in the deli.
But there's also the idea that a lot of you are hand harvesting. There's a lot of incredible care that goes into what you're doing as well. And
Exactly.
that's beyond a critic saying, this is 95 points, and everybody goes crazy to buy it. But there's a lot of care and work that goes into these wines.
Well,
I think
I
that
call it also the minority complex. Like if you are Tamil in Sri Lanka, you have to study twice as hard to get the great job as a Sinhalese person, or everybody knows the minorities. And we are this small wine region, and I think we have to, if I make an oaky wine, I get nailed on the cross for it. If a Californian makes an oaky wine, oh, this is great to lay down for 10 years. And the same is with tannins, so we work twice as hard. I think we should have to work twice as hard to prove ourselves and to show that we are making quality wines.
I'd say our wines are twice as good.
So I was just on the point of value. I do think our wines definitely hold their own from a value point of view, and I personally have a very high level of confidence in our own wines and the wines of our region. That if you wanted to do a blind tasting and taste similar wines from around the world and taste them blind, that our wines do actually hold their own. So. Are they cheap? Are they good deals? Are they expensive? It's often in the eye of the holder, and it's really a question of relativity. What are you comparing it to? Can you find cheaper wines? You can always find cheaper wines. What are you in the market for? What do you want? And but ultimately, for the consumer, is it giving you pleasure? Do you want to have another bottle? Do you want to buy a case? And is it a good deal? And I think the same is true at any wine region around the world that one might examine. There are going to be cases where that's true here. There are going to be cases where the wine's overpriced. And there are going to be cases where it's kind of average. But there are definitely treasures to be found.
Well, one nice thing too is I think Long Island has, in America too, we have people drink Bud Light, which is very watered beer or whatever it is. And so, and the same you get the airline wines, I call them, which have fruit and alcohol, but you can't really tell where it's from. And Long Island wines show character and have terroir and have quite intensity. Could it be acidity, minerality, a lot of different things going on. And for some people, that may be a little bit too intense, and they rather have the bigger bottle of Yellowtail, which is, it's fine. There are moments where that fits. But we really can't make those wines on Long Island. We don't want to make those wines. That's why I'm still here so after all these years, because we make very traditional wines. We make very earth-driven wines, when the character is the key and not just fruit and alcohol.
What grapes do you think best express Long Island's terroir or its personality? And from the ones that we have grown for a long time and that have been very traditional, what new things have you been excited to maybe experiment with and work with?
I don't know, for
I know you grow
Ladies
Riccatelli,
first.
and I was like, oh, he grows Riccatelli.
well, for us, like the two wines I brought tonight are our Sauvignon Blanc and our Cab Franc, which I think are really good examples of the terroir. Sauvignon Blanc, it grows really well in our climate. It's very refreshing. It goes well with seafood. And for us, we're able to make it in a couple different styles. And I think it's a really great expression of Long Island. Cab Franc also, it's kind of always been, it's been around for a while, but recently it's kind of become a little more, people are more interested in trying it. And I think it's, I'm not going to diss Merlot, because Merlot's, because Amy's the president of the Merlot Alliance. No, Merlot plays a really important role on Long Island.
You make beautiful Merlot.
It's the
Merlot's great.
backbone of all of our high-end blends. For me, on personally, I get more excited though about our Cab Franc. I think it's a little bit quirky and it's a little bit savory and really interesting. And you guys can try it tonight and see what you think.
And you've made a few different interesting things with your Cab Franc. You did a pet net with your Cab Franc, didn't
We
you?
did do a rosé sparkling Cab Franc, which we're doing. And we also do a red wine, and it's also a big part of our rosé, our regular rosé. So.
Roman?
I love Merlot. It is a great variety. It can be lush. It ripens early. It's very forgiving. And unfortunately, as a result, some people treated it badly because you can overcrop it, still make an okay red wine with it. But if you treat it nicely and you shoot position and you make sure that every cluster gets exposed to the sun and the crop level is right, you can make wines that age 30, 40 years. Our $100 wine is 97% Merlot. So we really believe that Merlot is the key to success. And Cab Franc is exciting, and in some years Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir as well. But I wouldn't want to hang my business on solely on Cab Franc and on Pinot Noir. Merlot is still the key for us.
So, at Pomanac we grow 8 varieties, one of which is Merlot, and I absolutely believe that Merlot is very well suited to Long Island, and I think that's been a narrative that you've heard from Long Island for a very long time, for good reason, as you well know. Because Merlot grows so well here, it's reliable to consistently ripen well, which is the name of the game and what we do, which is in producing fine wine. We also grow Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc, and we also grow Chenin Blanc, all 3 of which are Loire varieties. And so what's become clear to me at Pomanac over time is that the Bordeaux varieties do well. We grow Cab Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Petit Verdot, all of which are Bordeaux red varieties. And for whites, we grow the Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and Riesling. So the Bordeaux varieties seem to do quite well. Loire varieties do well, really well. And then my mother is born and raised in the Pfalz in Germany, and for that reason we planted Riesling. And Riesling has turned out to do really well for us too, and I know Roman makes an outstanding Riesling as well. And so, as my father says, if you forced us to rip out one of the 8 we grow, we wouldn't know where to begin. And in fact, we've just had a couple meetings at Pomanac where we have a new property that we're looking to plant, and we're actually looking to maybe plant some new varieties.
Cool. Like what?
Like for example, already now I believe we're the only vineyard in New York growing 3 Loire varieties: Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc. But if you examine the Loire and its similarities with Long Island, the region that's most comparable is actually Muscadet, which is closest to the Atlantic, where they grow Melon de Bourgogne. So we might experiment with a little bit of Melon. We might plant a little bit of Albarino for the same reason, and there's already at least one other. I know at Palmer they've planted some Albarino. I'm not sure if anyone else is doing it, but
one woman.
But there are some logical reasons why we might experiment. Like for example, Albarino is grown in the northwest of Spain in Galicia, where their climate is somewhat similar to ours. It has a thicker skinned grape, which will make it more rot hardy, and it should fare well in our climate. We might add some Malbec, which would be the 5th Bordeaux variety that we don't grow yet. We might plant a little bit of Pinot Noir only for sparkling wine. I'm not really interested in making it into a red wine necessarily. And so I'm so excited that we have the repertoire that we already do in terms of the varieties we work with, and the knowledge that there's over 30 varieties that are grown commercially right now on Long Island, and many of them make delicious wines. And there are few wine regions around the world where you can say the same thing.
I think it's an endorsement or an underlining how great this wine region is, that you can really do well the whites, we can really do well red wines, and that's, at the end, time will tell, of course. Some varieties will shine more than others, but in general we do very well because we have this it's unique, that's what's so nice. We have the sun of Madrid and Naples, the sun is intense out here, yet we have the cool ocean breeze, and that is a combination that not many wine regions have.
And just as an aside or something for you all to consider, to taste so many of the beautiful wines from Long Island. There's a wonderful, wonderful event that's going on August 5th, Saturday, August 5th. It's coming up, called Harvest East End. 17 producers from Long Island will be there, pouring all kinds of interesting things. I highly, highly recommend you go. It's just a great event that happens every year, and a really good opportunity to taste a lot of different things from a lot of different producers, and you get to talk to the winemakers often too, which is really a treat and a rare treat. So if you go to, I think it's liwines.com, to the Long Island Wine Council website, and
It's
you can.
where's at Martha
It's at, and
Clara,
I'm
I
sorry,
believe.
and it's at Martha Clara, and it begins at 2 p.m., I believe. And my final question for all of
Are we
you.
already out?
Is it too early? Am I done?
I don't know.
Are we okay? All right.
Questions and answers?
When we're talking about vintage, vintage isn't just a number. It's a year in your life. And it's not just, okay, the growing season, blah. It's all of the things that happen to each of you personally and professionally. And I'd like to know, and I'm sure people in the audience would like to know, what year was the most meaningful to you, or the most interesting to you, for whatever reason that is. And if you could talk a little bit about that. And what's your favorite vintage? So personal, then favorite.
I guess that's relatively easy for me. I'll go with 2014. First of all, it was the year I married my lovely wife, Karen, sitting in the back. It was the year our daughter was conceived, which maybe that's too much information.
How did that go?
But 2014 was a remarkable year. It's the year that vintners dream of. We had very high yields and a high quality, and that's rare that happens. And so we had a very abundant crop and high quality, and you just it's just the exception that you see that, and it's basically what winemakers dream of. So.
So 2014 is personally and professionally your favorite vintage. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Kelly.
So for me, 2013, for a similar reason, I got married in 2013, and my wedding was actually on our first day of harvest.
Oh my God.
Which was
So bland.
which was fun, especially because my whole team went to the wedding. So basically, we harvested in the morning, we loaded the press, and we got done really fast, and then everyone went home and took a shower and went to the wedding. And 2013 was also a great year for us. I think my favorite year was 2010 because it was my first year with the McCarries. It was a very easy year. It wasn't a typical year for Long Island. It was very hot, and we were ahead of California with ripening. I think everyone talks about what a great year 2010 was, but and it was a great year, but for me personally, I don't think the wines were my favorite because they were kind of similar to California. They were all like very ripe and very, maybe some people went a little bit too aggressive in 2010 as far as like, oh, we can get it really ripe, and maybe went a little too far. But it was a really amazing year from a winemaking perspective because it was kind of like, okay, it's another beautiful day. I guess we'll, pick this or that. It was very relaxed and, low stress, and it was a great year to start with the McCarry family. So I have a lot of good memories of that year.
Well,
This
I
is
would
a bunch
say
of decades that you have to figure out.
well, 2013 was for us the vintage, which you only read about. I compared it with 1945 in Bordeaux. It was the vintage you read about. I've tasted twice the 45. It was just, the war ended too, so that was maybe why people liked the 45 so much. But it was just a dream vintage that, in our case, 13 reached that level with our top Merlot, for example. And that's something that is just very difficult when everything comes together. It's just a dream. And the only other vintage that would be comparable or surpassed, but at the time we were still young and the vineyards were younger, was 1995. And that was probably the reason why I'm still here. That brought us into all 4-star restaurants in New York at the time, Jean-Georges, L'Espinasse, Jean Terrell. And Christian changed the name from Sag Pond Vineyard to Wolfer Estate at the time because of the 95 vintage. And I think I made the best wine, one of the best wines in my life, our 95 Pinot Noir, which I opened for my 50th birthday last year, Magnum, and it was, everybody couldn't believe it. I only made one Magnum that year, and that was the bottle. So that was very special. And there are many every vintage is special in its own way because you give your life and your soul and your blood to these vintages, and it doesn't matter. I'm more proud sometimes of a difficult year than of a great year, which is, well, you better make a good wine in a great year.
2005, that was the year I think I met you. And that was a year where we had this beautiful growing season, and then we had this horrible rain at harvest. And a lot of you just sort of triumphed over adversity that year. And I remember you made an Amarone style at that year, which was beautiful. It's a beautiful wine.
Cool.
So I would love to open this up to questions. We have about 8 minutes to 7. Okay. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
7.
How much will climate change influence the types of grapes that are grown?
So I'm going to repeat the question so you can all hear. How much will climate change influence the wines in Long Island
It's already
and the grapes that we grow?
It's already influencing a lot. We used to barely start picking on Columbus Day weekend. Yeah, we would sort of just start with our rosé like 20 years ago, and now we're picking at least 2.5 weeks earlier, to 3 weeks almost earlier than those 25 years ago. So there's certainly already a change. For us, it's a bit of a mixed blessing. It's certainly a disaster here and there, but it does ripen your fruit earlier, and you get to another layer of ripening with this extra heat that we have had the last 5-6 years for sure.
Yes?
Do you monitor your vineyards with underground gauges to determine whether water, heat, or stress?
The question was, do you monitor your vineyards with underground gauges to monitor the stress on the vineyard, the water stress?
We don't currently, but that is one way to do it.
Mostly you see it on the leaves. When the leaves started turning away and start to shrivel, then you better put the irrigation on. And so, yeah. But we used to have, what are they called, the emitters,
Pressure bomb.
the pressure thing. We used to work with them, but you see, if you're in tune with your vineyard, we don't have 1,000 acres where you have to work with a computer because you never get to the other valley or something. So you really, if you're not on top of your vineyard, there's a problem.
So the gauge is their eyes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How does this year look so far?
The question was, how does this current vintage look so far?
This so far looks like the vintage of the year. That's a joke. But
Like my father says, you can't take it to the bank till it's in the tank. And so, literally, we can have another 2013 all over again, and if you get a hailstorm or a hurricane the day before you pick, it's lost.
Yeah.
And that brings up another one of my father's sayings, which is, winemaking is less of an art and more of a partnership with Mother Nature. Unfortunately, she's the senior partner.
So far, everything looks poised. All you can do is get your vineyard ready, that it's poised to take advantage if the next 5 weeks are like today. And you don't have bushy plants, and you have great low disease pressure, so it's the last area in New York State to get a frost, Long Island. So if you have great conditions and everything is poised for greatness, and then you get a little bit of luck, then you make good wine.
Kelly, is Joe happy or sad? I know there's a wine, actually. There's a wine called Joe's Tears that is named after his great passion.
Yeah, so far Joe's happy this year. Yeah, so his son has been taking care of the vineyard now this is his 6th year. So Joey really has, I would say, he's starting to get it dialed in as far as, it's been a tricky year. We've had some humid days. But the guys have been working really hard to keep the canopy open, get lots of airflow in there, and try to keep the disease pressure down. So,
he's had more time in his other garden than with pigs and everything else.
yeah. So.
Yeah.
How does the soil affect the taste in terms of the minerality of the wines?
So the question is, how does our soil affect the ultimate taste of the wine?
Well, I always believe this is this discussion that I don't believe that minerals climb through the vines and go into the grapes, basically. It has to do how the sun is stored, how the energy, how the heat basically is giving back during the day or at nighttime when it collects it during the day. So there's certain things like that. And most important is how water is stored and what the water holding capacity of the soil. And I mean, we have a clay loam silt mix with gravelly sand underneath it, so it's not that we have slate soils, for example, like in Germany. Yet our wines have a beautiful minerality, and I think it has to do with this slow and steady ripening curve that we have. That has to do with the breeze from the Atlantic. And instead of this very fast ripening curve where you get very tropical and banana and strong peach flavors, we get these more elegant, balanced flavors, and as a result there's this, well, is it acidity, is it minerality, is it flintiness, is it the yeast? So I think it's very suitable for soils that we have. But it's not, the minerality has to do with how the grapes ripen. Sorry, too long an answer.
Yes.
Kelly, how difficult has it been for you, if difficult is the right word, as a female winemaker? And have you been accepted?
The question is, has Kelly experienced any diversity as a female winemaker on Long Island, and does she feel accepted?
I think I'm accepted. I don't
I
know.
don't mean only in Long Island.
Yeah, no, for me personally, I mean, there was a lot of women who kind of paved the way ahead of me, which I think it's kind of amazing. I have a lot of role models from when I started in the industry. I worked for a lot of women winemakers, and they were people I looked up to a lot. So if you go back, a generation or even 2 generations before me, like there was women who kind of paved the way. Now I think it's become more commonplace. Long Island has a lower number of female winemakers compared to other regions, but it's changing. Yeah. In California, it's pretty common to see a female winemaker. But
There's 2, no? 2 in Long Island?
so
Allie and you?
Allie, me, Robin,
Oh, Robin.
One woman, what's her name?
Claudia.
Claudia.
Yeah.
Barbara, but,
Alyssa Goodell is poised.
Yeah, and actually one of my cellar hands is a woman too. So there's a lot of girls
Yeah.
on Long Island now. It's more and more. The assistant at Bedell is a female also. So I think that it's pretty commonplace.
With our group that Roman and I are in, the Long Island Merlot Alliance, we started a scholarship, and our first scholarship winner was a young woman who is second generation from the Cennino family, and she's going to Cornell to study to become a winemaker. So that's going to be
Yeah.
Amy, I think we need to stop it
Cut it?
there.
Thank you.
I know people would like to talk to the winemakers, but they're going to need to go upstairs to set up the wine. So if everybody would like to join us upstairs in the courtyard, I think we'll taste some of these great wines, shall we? Thank you.